Hello, everyone. Welcome back to CEDH Northwest. This week, we're going to talk about what it means to conduct threat assessment, to see different aspects of the game and evaluate what is going to impact your personal win rate, what is going to push you back or your opponents further ahead, and how to sort of like modulate that, and sort of what the model that I use for assessing that threat is. But first, before we get started on that, I do have one announcement I'm going to make, and that's this event here. It's called the Brainstorm. It's being put on by an LGS in Tacoma, Washington, called Mindful Games, and it's going to be a 10K. They want to make sure that we get as many people to show up as we can. So hopefully, if you see this, you're gonna make the effort to come out and play. It's a great area, a lot of really good players, and we're gonna have a good time. In addition to this event for CEDH 10K, they're gonna have a couple of other events going on, including Popper, including there's gonna be some Riftbound. I think there's gonna be Flesh and Blood. So if you play other games as well, they're gonna be doing some of those. So there's gonna be all sorts of stuff going on here. It's gonna be convention. They're hoping to hit 300 players, so let's try and make that happen. But going back to the main topic at hand. Okay, so what is threat assessment? So threat assessment is going to be, like I mentioned, it's going to be evaluating the risk to you and your game based upon a player's play patterns, what cards they're putting onto the field, what sort of politics they're making, the general strategy of your opponents. It's a pretty broad spectrum of what threat assessment is. There are a lot of things that can be threatening within a game, right? And so it's our job as players to make sure that we understand what is going to be punishing to us personally and impact our win rates, and what we can do to sort of mitigate those factors. So effective threat assessment is going to be really important. And some of the most key things that play into that are going to be identifying what moments of gameplay are going to be defining to that game. So, for example, if a Necropotence lands on turn 1 or 2, it's going to be a pretty defining moment of the game. I think everyone who plays CEDH knows that that's a pretty impactful play, and it's going to impact the rest of the way the game plays out. Similarly, there could be something that's not quite as big and splashy, obviously very powerful, but not quite as important. But it would be if someone played like a Rhystic Study on turn 2 or 3 or something, obviously very powerful, very similar to a Necropotence coming down in terms that they're both 3 enchantments that win the game, but it also means that the game is going in a different direction. Rather than there's going to be Ascend on turn 2 or 3 because of the Necropotence, it means that in all likelihood, the game is headed to turn 3 or 4 because the Rhystic Study player is going to want to make sure they farm out those resources from their opponents, and they're going to use their interaction that they're drawing into, in theory, especially with the new Rogrek and Ishai metagame, the slop or Rhystic Tribal or sort of like Rhystic Spam, whatever you want to call it, that type of new archetype that's coming out, that's a part of the metagame now. That's going to push the game in a specific direction, right? And so identifying that. Another important factor of threat assessment, this is a little bit more on like the high skill end, I think, as opposed to just like identifying, oh, that thing is bad or scary or the game is going in this direction, but is being able to sort of guesstimate where the game is going to end up so that you can tailor your earlier play patterns and game decisions to factor towards benefit in that late game state that you've identified, whether it's going to be a late game state that is going to be super high resources, everyone has a Tithe, a Rhystic, a Cabbage Merchant, a Lotho, is drawing 1 million cards, is making 1 million mana, or it's going to be something where the end of the game is going to be a super low resource one, because no one has any engines, no one's keeping any engines, whether it's going to be super politics driven, whether it's just going to sort of come down to life totals even, right? Like if things are getting pressured by commanders that are 4/4s in the command zone or 5/5s in the command zone, or people are spending a lot of life totals to do these value necropotences that they've been locked into deals with, or there's like bowmasters that's living that's just dinging everyone every time they draw a card, and people's life totals are dropping because of that. People are drawing cards with Timna combat plans. That's another end state of a game that you can identify, and as you get better at threat assessment, you'll be able to identify that earlier to sort of tailor your decisions, where if you can say, oh, this game is going to revolve around someone's going to go find Orcish Bowmasters or play Orcish Bowmasters in this game, I don't want to commit to my board with a lot of mana dorks or anything like that, because then my entire game plan is going to get demolished and I'll have nothing going for me, and I don't want to be a non-factor. So instead, I'm going to tailor myself to sort of a more Rhystic Study oriented or Mystic or more oriented, like enchantment non-creature plan, right? Something along those lines. Or I'm going to make sure that I find a piece of removal for Bowmasters, because I know that that's going to be a pivotal factor in the game, and I'm going to make sure that it doesn't hit my stuff, because I'm going to politic with this person and threaten them with this removal spell on the OBM, or I'm going to just immediately remove it and make sure it's not a piece of the game. That's another thing that you can do with threat assessment. So I have some factors listed down here that play into the level of threat that certain things can make, and that includes the degree of agency that a play provides or restricts, the amount of resources that are generated by a specific play, and I guess I should break these down and sort of give examples. So a degree of agency that a play provides or restricts, not super common in CEDH, but a very easy example would be, say an opponent has Aetherflux Reservoir on board and the ability to activate it for 50 life to target a player and kill them. Well, that is a very threatening play, because they have the ability to reduce the agency of a player to 0. Basically, you're under the gun of, if you do something that I do not like, I am going to target you and kill you with 50 damage on the stack right here, right now. So you don't have to find a way to outplay that. You can't really do anything that's too scary for them, or like too positive for you, because you have to, your agency has been restricted greatly by this play this opponent had made. Inversely, it could be something like a lot of agency is enabled. A more CEDH oriented example would be the resolution of an Adosium or a Necropotence immediately allows you to dump a ton of cards into your hand. This more cards equals more agency in this case, right? So you're going to have a lot of options and the ability to sort of tailor your game plan because of that. And the life total factor, you could argue that it restricts agency somewhat, because now you're committed to winning the game or whatever, but you can make the decision of what is an acceptable risk to take on the life total. So it's not really restricting agency that much. The amount of resources generated by the play, this sort of scales to the ad nauseam example I just provided, but it can also be extrapolated out to something like a Smothering Tithe. Smothering Tithe comes down on turn 2, and it's going to make a ton of resources almost immediately. Or if an opponent has like a Rhystic Study or a Mystic or more or something, this Tithe is going to generate a lot of resources, similar to the draw engine that you're going to be profiting off of from your opponent. So it's also generating them a lot of resources, but you have to evaluate the threat of those, because how many resources are my opponents generating? What type of resources? What does their deck care about making more? Is it cards or is it mana? Because different types of decks care more about one or the other. The longitudinal impact of a play is a little bit more abstract, but it's also really important. There are certain times, not all games, but certain plays, certain times and certain games where a player tutoring for what is a relatively innocuous card early can actually make a substantial impact several turns later in the game. I think a really good example of this would be probably something along the lines of maybe like Rogthras fires off a Sylvan Scrying that resolves, and they decide to, instead of get Talongates of Madara, they decide to get Boseiju for some reason, right? But that Boseiju doesn't do anything right away, but the longitudinal impact of that play is that 3 turns from now, as long as they have 1 green mana and a Rograk on the battlefield, Thrasios on the battlefield, your opponents can't realistically like try and do like a Tithe combo or a Breach combo or something like that without some variety of backup, right? So that one small play early is going to have a big impact later. And so if you're a Breach deck, knowing that your opponent just tutored for Boseiju on turn 2, the longitudinal impact of that play is very threatening for your game plan overall, right? You have to find a deflecting SWAT or a flash enabler or something to be able to play over the top or around the Boseiju. I think there are some other examples that we'll probably get into later regarding this. The type and number of win conditions available to a player is another factor, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't necessarily like. We think about this, right? Like, oh, an opponent can do this as a win condition, they can do this as a win condition. We have to think about those and like what our counterplay is. But I think something that maybe gets undervalued a little bit is just like the type of win conditions and the number of win conditions. This means like, so Thassa's Oracle is a 2-spell win condition, right? And it's a creature and a non-creature win condition. So that means that inherently, assuming no other interaction at the table, the combo plays around Mindbreak Trap all on its own. The combo plays around Deafening Silence all on its own. And if you were to use like a Tainted Pact instead of a Demonic Consultation, then you would be able to take some counterplay measures around a Fairy Mastermind activation, or if you have a Force Draw on your own battlefield due to like an Esper Sentinel or something along those lines, you'd be able to play around that. So there's that. There's Breach. Blue Farm sometimes plays Demonic Betrayal. This is just an easy way to like list off win conditions that are prevalent in decks. So let's say it's those 3 win cons. So that deck has 3 win conditions. But if they are playing Praetor's Grasp, you could maybe consider that a 4th win condition. If we pivot and look at Kinnan has Basalt Monolith and Hullbreaker Horror, and then tangentially Fairy Mastermind loops if they can clone a Smothering Tithe, right? So that's probably like 2 to 3, 2.5 win conditions, something like that. And those are all activated abilities, right? Except for the Hullbreaker Horror, which is spell casts. So that's something to keep in mind, is once the one pivotal spell resolves, you can't really, it can be much more difficult. You can definitely respond, but it can be much more difficult too, because a lot of conventional interaction is just counter magic, right? Or maybe removal. But if Kinnan has 6 extra mana, your Basalt Monolith combo is pretty much going to play right through the removal they fire at your Monolith, right? So they have to remove your Kinnan in response. So there are different factors, right? But both those decks don't have a lot of win conditions. But then if we look at something like they have like 3 win conditions. But if we look at something along the lines of, say, Rogthras has a number of win conditions. They have Oboro Breachecaller combo, they have Tangential Fairy Mastermind combo, they have Snap Paternal Witness combo, they have various non-deterministic, air quotes, lines with Valley Flood Caller and the Enduring Vitality to sort of just storm through their deck. They can find some sort of Badger Mole Cub combo. So, and these layer really well. So I think that's another thing to assess, is when you're looking at the number and types of win conditions, if a deck is able to layer their win conditions really tightly, they can play a lot more than you think they're able to, with cards that you don't necessarily think, as someone who's not piloting the list, or if you don't play against a lot, you might not see the threat of all of the win conditions in particular, right? Decks that play a lot of clones, once again, Rogthras, also have the option to sort of pick and choose and snipe win conditions from other lists, based upon the fact that the deck to my right played something that I really think is good for me, and the deck to my left played something that combos with that card. So I have 2 clones that I have available, so I'm going to go ahead and clone both, and then now I can present a win condition from something that's not in my deck, or using only 1, maybe 2 pieces from something in my deck, right? And so that's going to, it should make a difference in the way that players deal with lists, right? So Blue Farm's obviously incredibly potent and effective, same with Kinnan, but because their win conditions are relatively limited, all things considered, in terms of number and the type, the counterplay to them tends to be relatively straightforward. While something like Rogthras, because they play such a expansive degree of potential win conditions, non-deterministic storm, whether it's their Oboro combo or whatever it is, right? You kind of have to be a lot more wary of the random little dumpy pieces that they keep vomiting onto the battlefield, because a Mockingbird that gets cast and clones a Dryad Arbor might seem like nothing, right? They're just trying to turn on a Valley Flood or something. But as soon as they get to like Oboro and Badger Mole Cub, they can now return that Mockingbird to hand and start trying to win the game with a random combo. So there are a bunch of different things. Snap being in the graveyard because they used it as a removal spell earlier, but they've gotten to Gaia's Cradle and they're playing Eternal Witness. You have to do the math and count their Cradle and see if there's graveyard hate available to remove the snap, ask them what they're targeting, all these things play into that, right? This is a lot to it. All right. Now we're going to start to sort of break down the different types of lists and the way that you can assess the threats of the 2 to 3 different like genres of deck, right? So there are from hand decks. These decks are going to be the ones that I listed earlier. Things like Blue Farm, Kinnan, Rogsai. Those are going to be decks that don't necessarily keep... They can play to board, sure. They can just play out permanents early, one at a time, turn by turn, and accumulate massive board states, just like any other list. But that's not really their primary game plan. A lot of times they're trying to resolve 1, maybe 2 engines. They're just trying to dump stuff out there, and then they're going to kill you with a spell that you didn't know was in their hand because they drew it off one of their draw engines, or they top decked it for turn, and they finally saw a window, and they're going to shoot for it right now. You have to be ready for that, right? And so the idea of from hand decks is that the win condition is coming from the hand, so they're trying to catch you by surprise. And these decks are, generally speaking, the ones that are going to sort of indicate over at other boards and say, hey, that player over there has 3 mana dorks on the battlefield. Your Orcish Bowmaster pings should kill all of those, so that player can't play the game. And then they're going to go ahead and they're going to untap, and they're going to go Thoughtless Oracle, Underworld Breach, and because you didn't kill their Tymna, they now have Fierce Guardianship and Deflecting Swaddling Line to back it up. Whereas if you killed their Tymna, because they had 30 cards in their hand, then they wouldn't have been able to actually back up the win condition because they didn't have any permanents on the battlefield, right? So it's sort of like a jump scare thing. And this can be really effective because these decks are able to deflect tremendously well. Say, look at all that. That's super scary. I only have 10 cards in my hand, and I'm drawing 2 more cards for every game action you take. Think like Raw Geisha, right? My 3 Ristic studies look super scary, obviously, but if I have an Esper Sentinel, a Fairy Mastermind, and a Ristic, it doesn't look as bad. But because I only have 3 other lands on the battlefield, and like a Rogue Rack or something, right? It can't be that bad. But every time a player takes a game action, they're drawing 1 to 5 cards, and because of that, they're going to be untapping and then trying to kill you with their Underworld Breach or Tithe combo or something like that, and you didn't know that was coming because those decks also always have the option, because unless they're willing to show you their entire hand and like play heads up for the entire game, they always have the option to say, oh, but my hand is so terrible, or I can't win right now, and then they top deck a Born Upon the Wind and say, oh, well now I can win, but 30 seconds ago I couldn't. And so when decks like that are sort of like politicking and they're telling you like, don't look at me, don't listen, don't like remove my pieces, a lot of times, this is where the threat assessment comes in. A lot of times it might be correct to not mess with them, but a lot of times it might also be correct to mess with them. So even though you have the option with your OBM or your Mayhem Devil or whatever to blow up 3 creatures on Ronfrost's board, if they don't have a Gaia's Cradle or actually anything else going on, maybe you should let them have their 3 creatures and their 1 Thrasios spinner rotation, and instead just hit the Ristic player, hit them in the life total, right? Or blow up their Esper Sentinel or something because they have also a Ristic study. You don't want to take them out of the game entirely because then that skews the balance of the game. And I think we've talked about that a little bit before on this channel, where game balance can be really important to making sure that somebody doesn't sneak in a win. But you also want to make sure that if you have nothing better to do, don't shoot something on the battlefield when there are from hand decks at the table just because you can. A lot of times it's better to just shoot something that either doesn't matter, or if life total is at 0, that player loses the game. You can remove a lot of a player's agency by putting them to like 3 or 4 life off of Bowmaster pings or random Mayhem Devil pings or just combat damage or something. Turns out that from hand deck doesn't have as much agency to just win the game out of nowhere when you're able to say, hey, if you cast that spell, it triggers 3 Ristics and you're taking a Lightning Bolt and that's going to kill you, right? So then they sort of have to play more responsibly, and then they have to find a way to actually outplay the Orcish Bowmasters or whatever is pressuring them, whatever is restricting their agency. Okay, moving down, we see board committed lists. These, on the flip side here, these are the decks like Rogthras, and these are the ones that vomit permanent spells out onto the battlefield. They don't really keep many cards in their hand because they're just playing them out repeatedly. The decks care more about mana than card advantage, typically. They don't have a lot of ways to just kill you out of hand. Or if they do, they are killing you out of hand, then they're doing it by committing a bunch of little dumpy creatures to the battlefield, or little dumpy permanents to the battlefield, right? If you think like we'll use Rogthras first, they play out a bunch of creatures and they Court of Calling for Oboro Breeze Caller and play Gaia's Cradle's Land for turn. Yeah, you're obviously going to die, but that wasn't really from hand, because every time they play a dumper and then they follow it up with a cord, you need to counter the cord because they're going to go get something scary, or you need to put a condition on the cord or something like that, right? So board committed lists, you can sort of see the win condition coming. Sort of contrary to from hand lists, like I said, they don't keep a lot of cards in hand typically. And their argument is frequently going to be, oh, well, I only have 2 cards in my hand. Meanwhile, they have 65 mana on the battlefield from various different sources and activations and whatnot. And because of that, they're going to be able to have access to 20 cards on command. They just are only keeping 2 in hand right now because that gives them the excuse to whine and say, hey, don't blow up my 3 X1s that do nothing but feed my Gaia's Cradle count, because then I only have 2 cards in my hand. You're going to take me out of the game. And then you can look at them and say, yeah, but these 3 creatures equate to 9 mana or something, because you have Kinnan, Bambi, and Badgermal Cub on the battlefield. So I'm actually going to shoot your stuff, or I'm going to kill your Badgermal Cub or something like that, right? You don't have to take them out of the game, but removing small pieces from their board sequentially and continuously can sort of trim the ability of that deck to just snowball and kill you, because board committed decks tend to be more snowbally than from hand decks. From hand decks have that jump scare factor. Board committed decks tend to sort of play out something, it sits because it's dumpy and they're not really doing anything. Play out something else, sits because it's marginally less dumpy, but it's still not really doing anything. And they play out something else, and now because they have all 3 of these medium things, but you have all 3 of them together, they've assembled Exodia, and so now they're going to do something that's even scarier and even scarier and even scarier, and it just keeps going and going and going, and you interact with them once, and that's fine for them because it doesn't actually reverse their momentum or stop it. It just slows it or presses pause for a moment while they are able to then resolve the latest tutor in their chain to put a new piece into play that constitutes something similar on a pivot, so they can now go again, right? And so it's really important that you're able to sort of check those decks as they develop, so they don't get to that snowball state, right? Rogthras having 4 creatures in a cradle is scary-ish, but it's only scary-ish in the sense that if you let them have something else, they can start snowballing, right? But if you don't let them have their Bioman, or they pass the turn and with a Gaia's Cradle and 10 dudes, but they're fully tapped out, and you just start picking off their guys or blow up their cradle or something, they're untapping from ground 0 basically, and they have to rebuild. Or they try and pass the turn with a bunch of mana. You force them to act in their own end step by trying to blow up their Thrasios or something. That takes away a lot of their agency, takes away a lot of their ability to sort of snowball out of nowhere. I think another really good example of board committed decks would be traditional Sisay. So Trad Sisay basically just plays out their commander, and that's not super duper scary. It's a 3 mana, do nothing, turns on Fierce and Relic and whatnot. Maybe they can help interact. And they're going to activate once, and they're going to get a Ragavan or something and buff it up, or they're going to play a Lotho and buff her up and make some more mana. Now they have 1 activation while Sisay's at 4 power, and that allows them to spin an end step, get a silence effect, go to their turn, spin and get a Derevi, untap something, spin again, get something else, spin it, and they can, like I said, it's that snowball effect, right? So you don't want to let decks like Sisay have a ton of mana and their commander. You don't let them have either their commander or the resources to make mana. But you don't really want to let them have mana and their commander and legends, right? So it's, once again, it goes back to that trimming factor of you want to make sure that, oh, well, yeah, you can have Sisay and Lotho. Okay, you've gotten to 5 mana. I'm going to Bowmaster your Lotho now. You can activate and put Sisay, or you Bowmaster it in response to the Sisay activation, such her power drops or something, right? So you're like, okay, you can replace the Lotho, but you just cracked 5 treasures to do that. So you're now playing a relatively fair game because I've completely stopped all forward momentum. And then when you're ready to win, of course, you can trim them super early. You can force people to act at really inopportune times in order to push them into positions where they deplete their resources. You can send them back to the Stone Ages, and then you can go to your turn if they have to try and rebuild or something like that. There are like sort of hybrid archetypes. These are probably the most like actually threatening ones. I know I mentioned Rog Faraz as a board committed deck, but it can be hand as well, because a lot of lists like play like a Song of Creation or an Underworld Breach or something. But hybrid lists sort of like walk this like rotating middle ground between hand from hand decks and board committed. I think TNT is probably a really, really good example of this. Kinnan can also be a pretty decent example of this. Basically, these hybrid lists can sort of choose a pivot point at various times throughout a game, where, okay, if there's going to be a Bowmasters, or if I know there's a chance for like a Curse Totem or something, I'm going to play a from hand game. I'm going to play the Ristic Study game. I'm going to play passive triggers and whatnot, things that are not going to get me like hated out by this Grafter's Cage or this Curse Totem or whatever. But they can also sort of, if they're saying, oh, all of these, like I'm playing as 3 Rog Ishais, right? And they're going to counter every spell that means anything to me. I'm going to sort of just like play a bunch of dumpy stuff that they don't really want to waste a counter spell on, and then try and take that snowball angle where I'm going to cast something, they can counter it. I'm going to cast something else, they can counter it. But now I'm going to cast something else, and they can counter. And every single one of these is threatening to be just as lethal as the one before it, because they didn't deal with your board state ahead of time. Or if we think in terms of like Magda, I think Magda is another really good example of like a board committed deck here. I can't believe I actually didn't write it down sooner. But Magda's super board committed. They play their Magda, they play their dwarves, and then once those 2 or 3 things are down, they get like a career down. They actually don't care about resolving spells anymore. Magda's not a hybrid deck, but like that's the idea of you can the pivot lists, the hybrid lists can take that angle where they can play through whatever the most prominent or dominating or threatening archetype at the table is going to be, right? And then archetypal swaps. This is just a note here, is that certain commanders have sub archetypes, and so they can sort of like trick you just by who's in the command zone. So for example, if we think CEDH, and I've been talking about Kinnan, we all know that I'm talking about NBC, No Bad Cards Kinnan, right? The one developed by Freedom Waffle. But there are other types of Kinnans you can play. Big Flips is still an archetype that exists. One of my local players recently picked it up, actually. And that deck's incredibly devastating, especially when you don't know if you're playing into NBC or into Big Flips. The deck basically just resolves a bunch of mana and a Kinnan, and then just starts spinning, and then those spins chain, and you're able to continue and continue. And then even if you whiff, like they have 6 creatures on the battlefield. A lot of them are like 4/4s to 6/6s. And so they can pressure you with damage. They can, but the point is they're not casting spells anymore, right? And so it can be challenging to identify that ahead of time. And so sort of like part of that threat assessment process, I guess, would be, you could to some extent say it starts before the physical game begins, where you're trying to start a conversation with your opponents and figure out what type of archetype they're playing. It's if you see a Kinnan, it's probably NBC Kinnan. That deck is generally stronger, but also like they might just randomly blow you out on turn 3 with Big Flips, so there's nothing you can do about it because you didn't counterspell a Soul Ring or remove the Kinnan, right? Kinnan should probably be removed in most cases, but you didn't counter their Mana Dork. You didn't react to their spin, and therefore you died because they flipped the Nyxbloom Ancient, got 3 more spins, spun again, flipped a Glenelendra Archmage, flipped a Void Winnower, and then flipped the Seedboard Muse, and now you're actually just dead, right? So, things to think about. There's also going to be some additional aspects to threat assessment. These are listed here. Let's pretty quickly go through them. I had a note about YAP. So when we're talking about like assessing not just the cardboard, right, but the players. You can assess players as and try to determine their threat level that way too, right? That's kind of how you can determine what's in someone's hands, like reading them, right? Think poker. But there's the idea of like yap. And so if someone's talking a lot, that might mean that they have everything, or they might mean they have nothing, right? And so you kind of have to figure that out. And that's easier if you play with certain players a lot versus players you don't play with a lot. But they're also just general, like, there are just general rules that you can, of thumb, that you can apply, such as if a player is talking a lot on a spell that doesn't matter, that spell matters to them for some reason. And so you have to kind of determine what is the reason behind that, and how threatening is that to me? There's the idea of credibility, where, and I don't want to get too deep into this one, but lying and honesty, they're like the way that those two concepts interact with CEDH as a game can be kind of like it's a sensitive subject, right? People have very definite opinions on this. Some people think that lying is completely fine. Some people think that lying is completely unacceptable. I'm not going to render an opinion on this one, but I am going to say that credibility of players is something that you can use to assess the threat of deals that they are making or plays that they are making, right? If you've been told by 2 to 3 people that, oh, this player you're matching in with they're a liar, they can't be trusted, it's not to say that you shouldn't make a deal with them, that you shouldn't trust them, but it is to say that you should, as with everything in this game, assess the impact that the deal is going to have for you. What is the impact if that deal is broken? And what do you think the likelihood this player is going to break that deal and or lie to you and or all these things, right? Just keep in mind that your opponents don't have your best interest at heart in terms of the game. They are playing to win just as much as you are. And so because of that, you have to make your decisions based upon what is the best thing for you. And then deck speed means that the faster decks are generally, you should probably attribute a higher degree of threat level to those decks in the early game because they're going to try and kill you immediately, and you have to be ready for that. The Sol Ring that Rao plays on turn 1 is way scarier than the Sol Ring TNT plays on turn 1, right? 90% of the time. There are obviously exceptions, God hands, blah, blah, blah. But like I always say, we aren't talking about the exceptions. The general rule of thumb is going to be that the faster decks, their plays are scarier earlier because they're trying to kill you faster. Versus when the, I don't know, what's a good example of a mid-range deck? When the Dog Thrast, the Yoshi Thrast player, plays a Smothering Tithe or a Knight of the Reliquary on turn 3 or 4, like, okay, well, we've faded the early game threat. This is probably a lot scarier now, and how do I deal with this? And so figuring out sort of those options there as you have that, sort of wobbling between that too, right? It always goes back to the deck speed model that we've talked about numerous times before, that red circle where the fast decks versus the slow decks, and sort of when they're trying to kill you and what their pivots are. Speaking of models, my favorite part of the episodes. Okay, we're going to sort of break down this model of threat assessment that I've created. It talks about the long and the short, and we'll break down each of the sections, but it talks about the actual process that I use and that I think a lot of players use subconsciously to determine what's going to be scary in a game, how that's going to affect them, how to counterplay it, and what happens if you don't counterplay it. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning. We see this bubble called loss condition identified, right? So at all points of the game, there are certain conditions that need to be met for players to win. And inversely, if you are not the player who is trying to meet the condition to win, there are certain conditions that need to be met in order for you to lose, right? And so because of that, the loss condition of a game can actually be identified relatively easily, even if that happens multiple times per turn, per game. Like, this model is constantly fluctuating, and you should be reevaluating consistently, right? A spell that someone plays that is a loss condition right now, once they pass the turn, maybe that spell is no longer a loss condition, at least until their turn or some other tertiary condition is met, right? So loss condition identified. If someone has Thassa's Oracle on the stack, loss condition is demonic consultation resolving, right? And then the trigger resolving. So that's your loss condition identified. Could also be something along the lines of Rog Thrast getting to Cradle and an untapper, or if Kinnan or Rog Ishai sticks 1 to 2 heuristic studies, something like these are lost conditions. They might not kill you immediately, but they're the conditions that will fulfill the requirement for you to lose. So once you've identified that, then you have to figure out where you are in reference to that loss condition. So let's say if we start at the beginning of the game, we see our pod is going to be Raw Gishai, Blue Farm, and let's say Sisay. Raw Gishai, Blue Farm, Sisay. The loss conditions, so we can identify 3 of them right off the bat, right? Raw Gishai, drawing infinite cards, making a ton of mana, that's a loss condition. Blue Farm, drawing a lot of cards, casting like Ad Nauseam or a Silence or even their own heuristic study, that can be a lot. If they draw a lot of cards, that can be a loss condition. If Sisay makes 5 mana, that is a loss condition, right? If Sisay has an activation with her on the battlefield and her power's like 3, that's probably a loss condition, right? If she has 10 mana, that's definitely a loss condition. So you've identified those. The game starts, players are taking game actions. You now have to determine, as the game goes and players take actual game actions, how quickly are we progressing towards each of these loss conditions? What is the importance order of these loss conditions, right? If Raw Gishai resolves 1 heuristic study, we are progressing towards a loss condition, most certainly, right? But that might not be as bad as the fact that Sisay is trying to resolve Smothering Tithe. Because Smothering Tithe, the Sisay on field, you're probably just, and there's a heuristic study from Raw Gishai, you're probably just going to die in the turn rotation. So with that, you have to determine the progress towards each loss condition. So, and what is it worth to you to stop those various things? And that sort of feeds into the next slide, where we can see up here, we go over to the right, we split into 2 paths. We can either form a coalition, or we can not form a coalition. This is in here because threats to you are frequently also threats to the rest of the table. Not always, but a lot of times, especially when it comes to loss conditions, right? So when Sisay is trying to resolve a Smothering Tithe, because of the heuristic study that Raw Gishai resolved, or even just in general, never let that deck have a tithe. Cabbage Merchant is second worst, Lotho is the third. The idea is this is really, really bad for the table. This is going to resolve, and there's not going to be a lot we can do for it against it now because the deck is board committed, so we have to find our removal spells. We have to find a way to stop Sisay from activating, to blow up the Tithe, to remove Sisay repeatedly, things along these lines, right? And so we need to, the easiest way to go about this is to form a coalition with other players, say, hey, this is really bad for all of us. I do have a counterspell, or I don't have a counterspell. What can you all do about it? And then, so assuming that you're able to collaborate with other players, form a coalition, you can work together to halt your progress towards that loss condition, and, or at the very least, like pause it, or hopefully you can even maybe reverse it a little bit. You can send that player back if they pushed too far ahead. And then if you do that, you can see like the little loop around here, that'll send you back to the start, where you're now identifying whatever the loss condition is, whatever that new loss condition is, right? So in this case, if Smothering Tithe gets countered, that's really good. You don't have to worry about that anymore. Except it did get countered by Offer You Can't Refuse, which gives Sisay 2 mana of any color and their treasures, so they can double with Kitten, things like that. So now you have to evaluate again. Okay, so now what's our loss condition? Is our loss condition Sisay just gets to 5 mana now because they have a Kinnan on the battlefield? If that's the case, do they actually have to get to 5 mana, or do they also have an Agatha Soul Cauldron? So I actually just need 1 additional mana. What does this look like, right? If we don't form a coalition, so we look at Raw Gishai and say, hey, I don't have a counterspell. You have to counterspell this Tithe or we're going to lose. And the Raw Gishai player goes, no, I want to clone it. I'm not going to mess around with it. It's fine. I'm just going to go to my turn and copy enchant or flash photo it or whatever. Okay, so the coalition was not formed, so you're progressing towards the loss condition, right? You're moving on, you're moving forwards, and you're getting closer towards Sisay killing you. This is your final intervention opportunity, is what occurs next. So let's say that you took your turn and you didn't pay for Smothering Tithe, and Sisay has 4 mana, and you're casting a spell, and you are neglecting, you say, I'm not going to pay for this heuristic study. You can't afford to draw, where if you do, you have to respond to the Smothering Tithe trigger before Sisei gets that 5th treasure, because once they get the 5th treasure, there's nothing we can do. We've already talked about it. We don't have removal. There's like, the game is over. This is your final intervention opportunity. This is the last chance the table collectively has. And we see the dashed line down here. That's because it goes back all the way back past this one and up to the start. It goes back to progress towards loss condition. You've determined that the final intervention step is going to take you back to here. You say, this is the last chance. We know that we're here. We either have the opportunity to form a coalition and take some actions against this right now, and then hopefully we can halt or reverse this progress towards our loss condition. Well, otherwise, if we don't form a coalition, our loss con is going to continue, and once that happens, we are currently in the final intervention opportunity step. If we pass this point, the game is over. The game loss ensues. There is nothing we can do. We are dead. And so that's sort of the last chance you get to try and salvage the situation, as I like to say. And so altogether, it sort of looks like this, right? Loss condition, we say, hey, Sisei's putting Tithe on this. Sisei's trying to resolve Tithe. They get to 5 mana and kill us. We're determining progress at various points through the game. Hey, Sisei put Tithe on the stack. You have a Heuristic Study. We have to be really careful about the cards we draw, or ideally we can counter this or remove Sisei or remove the Tithe immediately or something. Can anyone do this? No? All right. So we're not forming a coalition. We're going to move along through the game. Okay, I'm casting the spell. I'm not going to pay for study. This is our last chance. Don't draw. If you draw, we die. Otherwise, you have to respond to the trigger and still remove the Sisei. Otherwise, we die. We're going to look here one more time. We've identified the loss condition. We know exactly where we are in the progress. Progress is right before game loss. You have to do something about this. Can we form a coalition? Oh, we can? Okay, great. You can remove the Sisei here before they get their 5th treasure. Excellent. Okay. The Sisei's been Floodmock. Great. We've halted the progress, but as soon as Sisei lands next turn, we're still dead. So this is our new loss condition is stopping Sisei from killing us, or from resolving so that she can kill us. Either that, or it is making sure that a bunch of Sisei's mana is removed, or that there are no legends on the battlefield so she doesn't get a buff or something like that. And that's our new loss condition is these things happening. So we've identified our progress. Can we do anything about it? No? Okay. We're going to continue towards the loss condition. This is our final intervention opportunity right here. Can we stop Sisei from resolving or deplete their mana? It's a creature spell. No, we can't. Okay. Sisei resolves. Sisei activates. We've died. And then the game is over. Game loss ensues. So altogether, that's sort of what it looks like. And like I mentioned, these are happening in a bunch of small micro decisions and micro assessments throughout the course of the game, and they're constantly shifting. Just because Sisei is trying to kill you by resolving this Tithe right now, if Sisei resolves this Tithe and passes and gets to 4 treasures or whatever, and the blue farm goes Grand Abolisher and triggers Heuristic Study and decides not to pay for it, if Sisei can't actually kill you right now, they can, like, maybe our loss condition is we have 2 loss conditions right now, so we're navigating parallel things, but maybe we can mitigate one of them, one of the loss conditions, by leveraging the threat of the other one. Say, hey, this Grand Abolisher resolves, like, I have a Flood Maw, I can stop your Sisei, so I can halt the progress towards this, but we can also work together simultaneously, forming our own. Sisei, you and I can form a coalition versus Blue Farm against this Grand Abolisher, where I'll let you activate, you go get Airtie, because that's in your list. You can counter the Grand Abolisher, and that halts their progress towards WinCon, because if they keep feeding into study through this Tithe, they'll just lose in progress, like in turn anyways. So they can't really do that, or they have to deal with you first, but they probably don't have enough removal, otherwise they already would have done it. So let's form our own coalition. We can halt this progress, and then by halting that progress that Blue Farm's trying to make towards their win con, your loss con, you've also set Sisei back because you ate 5 of their treasures. They got Airtie instead of like a Cradle or a Derevi or something. And so you can sort of stop yourself in multiple directions while navigating these intersecting and branching threat trees, right? So I think that's the main thing to take away from this episode is that this model right here, it lays out the process of assessing loss conditions and threats in like a very specific linear manner. But this is not the only way, and a lot of it is very nuanced because you have to layer your different assessments, and the trees frequently intersect, where halting one loss condition can be the same as forming a coalition with that player, right? Where you say, hey, I'll do this super scary thing, but I won't kill you. I won't progress my board state using it. Instead, I'll use this so that we don't die to this. And you're going to let me do it instead of using the counterplay that I know you have, because you also don't want to die. So we'll form a coalition, work together. And by doing this, I get to develop this thing that could advance my board in theory, but it stops this player from killing us. And you aren't going to counterplay me from developing this because it stops this player and you don't want to die to them. And then you also have this resource still, so you can use that later so that you can stop me or stop another player or something like that, right? So that's sort of the idea of threat assessment right there. I don't have any additional slides for this episode. I think the main takeaway here is just going to be this model, and then the from hand and board committed idea is just the short and sweet is look at from hand decks, think about their win cons, right? The type and number. If the win condition is like easy to come from hand, be aware of that. That's probably a from hand deck. If they can commit to the board and when using activations or like just dumping permanents into field, they can win off that, they're probably board committed. If they have pivot plans that can do both, that's a hybrid deck. You just have to play really, really carefully and try and identify what their objective is and lock them into a specific strategy so they can't pivot and can't do the thing that's most optimal for them. And then just try not to get jump scared by archetypal swaps from the command zone, right? If you're playing versus Big Flips Kinnan or NBC Kinnan or Traditional Sisay or Chowder Sisay or stacks, like a stacks deck or a turbo deck that can both look very similar with like Rogue Wreck and Tevish Thought in the command zone, things like that. Just being aware and keeping in mind that your opponents don't have your best interests at heart. When it comes to the game, they are trying to win. You are trying to win. Their best interest is not always going to align with your best interest, even if you do form a coalition, right? They're forming a coalition with you because they think that's their best option right now, not because they think it's your best option right now. And perhaps those interline, perhaps those intersect, but that doesn't mean that you're halting progress towards your loss condition from that opponent. You two are just working together to halt the progress from a different opponent. And you have to be aware of that. So that's everything I have for now. Hopefully this episode was useful and helps you determine what is scary and not as you are playing CEDH. Please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe. And then if you can share out the channel, that's great. You get some extra views, some extra subscribes, and share some more theory about CEDH out there. I'll have the link for the Mindful Brainstorm event in the description below, as well as any additional comments I'll do my best to respond to. So thank you everyone for watching, and I'll catch you next time.